Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics, brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer of comics like the Reckless series, including its most recent release, Follow Me Down, Friday over at Panel Syndicate, and the upcoming graphic novel, Night Fever. It's Ed Brubaker. Thanks for coming on, Ed.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
So how's your Friday treating you? I know you got a busy schedule right now. Everything good?
Oh, yeah. We did the library panel yesterday, me and Marcos, with some other people, which was a lot of fun, about the crime and young adult stuff. And then I've been having these daily meetings for like 3 or 4 hours a day, breaking one of our books into a movie with this director I'm working with. And so that's been like, I'm juggling that around writing the comics and stuff. And it's been a lot.
It sounds like a lot.
Yeah, but fun.
I know you can't really go too deep into the movie part of it, but it is really fascinating. I mean, looking at your own work from a very specific medium and then trying to translate that into another medium. I mean, in some ways, it seems like it might be kind of straightforward, but I imagine it's a very unique challenge trying to make that work.
Initially, I didn't want to do it for my own stuff. I thought, well, if it's a way into screenwriting, but I thought I'd rather have other people adapt my stuff, because I figure once you've written it one way, that's kind of your default to how you want to tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, well, I told it that way. But also, like, I never have written a comic where I'm like, well, this is a great idea for a movie, I'm going to write it as a comic first.
Right.
Like proof of concept stuff. But it's like, comics is in my blood. Like, that's my first language. So I'm not one of those, like, people. And I know some really great writers who have had like screenplays where they're like, oh, I can't sell this, I'm gonna turn it into a graphic novel, and they still make it into a great comic. But for me, I always am just like, make it whatever it is, like make it for that medium. So like adapting the story from a comic into a movie or a comic into a TV show, it's like, for me, it's a much harder thing to do than just writing it the first time, because I want it to be like a great TV episode or a great movie. Like, I don't want it to, but I don't want it to be so beholden to the source material that I'm unwilling to let stuff be changed. And a couple of our books have been adapted, like script wise have been adapted for features before that haven't gotten made. And I've had like really big, like, Pulitzer Prize winning like writers and, big like script doctor kind of people adapt them. And, it's been very rare that whatever is the magic of what Sean and I do isn't lost somehow in that translation. So I felt like I at least have to like try to always keep myself involved so that I can make sure, that this doesn't just warp into something else that's forgetting about the source material. Because I think there's just an adaptation to film in general, it's like you're either going to get something that's very faithful, like No Country for Old Men, that sort of pulls it off and feels like, oh, this is totally the book, but also it's a great movie, or a Fight Club, or you're going to get something, like that last Jack Reacher movie where you're like, well, it's got some of the story of the book in it, but
yeah,
it kind of, but it's like. And I tried to get the job writing that, so I'm bitter. But it's a really difficult thing. In a way, like for me, it's helpful to have like either a really good executive who has like a vision, for like what they like about it that they want to bring over to whatever other medium, or a director who is like trying to picture it as a movie that they want to shoot, and then you kind of. For me, it's trying to make sure whatever the central thing about the book that means something to me, or the character that means something to me, translates through. And I'm totally fine if other things change, as long as as long as you could pick up the book after you saw the movie and go, oh yeah, I can see how they, like it started from this, like LA Confidential,
Oh
like
yeah.
that movie, that movie's like a third of that book, if that, and it skips a lot of stuff.
I did a 8th grade school report on LA Confidential, which inspired my teacher to have a conference with my parents to ask me if I'm reading responsible things for my age. There's a lot more drugs in my book than there was in other books. A lot more various. Hilarious. What is it? Vice? A lot of Vice stuff in there.
Yeah, I was told I had to redo my it was like 11th grade. I had done my like whatever the final essay, a book report thing. I did the basketball diaries, and there was too much heroin in that.
There's a lot of heroin in that.
Yeah.
But adaptations are fascinating. I don't want to go too far down this thread, but I really love Emily St. John Mandel. It's like such a fantastic novelist, and like I love Station 11, the book, but I actually like the show more. And it's really fascinating to see how like that adaptation was turned into something.
I will say, like halfway through the season, I didn't feel that way. Like the first half of the season, I was like, oh man, they're messing it up, or they're missing things, or like somehow I just didn't feel like it was going to work. And then I really felt like the last half of the season, I was like, no, these are all the exact right decisions. I was totally crazy.
Yeah.
Like, it amped up tension way more than the book ever did, I mean, it was such a good, it was so good. And she's such a great actress.
Yeah, it's a fantastic series. I recommend it to everybody. And as soon as I say it starts with a pandemic and everyone dies, and they're like, no, I'm out. Nope.
Yeah, no, I put off watching it until it was all done because of that. And it's like everybody working on it is somebody I'm a fan of, literally. And I just was like, I don't know. And then once I started watching it, I was like, oh, I can't. This is beautiful somehow, like, and fills you with like hope a little bit,
Yeah.
Though dread a lot for like parts of it.
Significant dread. But let's get into the comic stuff. I wanted to start with Friday. I was trying to think of the most condensed way I could describe it. What comes next for Nancy Drew and Encyclopedia Brown after they grow up a bit and start having young adult problems, but also have a massive mystery to solve? It's focused on Friday Fitzhugh, who's an amazing character. It's over at Panel Syndicate with Marcos Martin and Munsa Vicente on art. It's so good. It's 6 issues deep and every issue is great, but I'm curious on your perspective. It's like you've been working on this started in April 2020. Yeah. So it's been going for a bit. It's such an interesting swing for you because Panel Syndicate's way different than what you normally do. It feels like, I don't know. I'm not saying that your other projects aren't fun, but it feels like you having fun.
One of the things that I've discovered with this and all the stuff I'm doing with Sean, though, with Sean, I try to set a vague page rate ahead of time and aim to hit that, and knowing that if I go too far over it, we might miss our printing deadline. With Friday, initially, I thought the chapters would be 15 or 20 pages long, and then they ended up all being about 35 pages long or 40 pages long.
Right.
So once we decided that, like, Marcos told me early on he was not going to work on any kind of deadline schedule with it because he never wanted to turn in a page of art for a book that he owned like this that he wasn't happy with. He never wanted to let his art go before he was happy with it anymore. Like he just, I think over the years of, deadlines at Marvel and DC and stuff, you as an artist, you inevitably turn in some pages you don't love. I think he wanted to be really precious about it. And so we would just work at our own pace. And, I write slower when I'm working with a slower artist because I have more time to think about it and map everything out. And I just kind of let the chapters find their own pace. The first one was the shortest one. The second one, I wanted to tell you all their backstory. And it ended up being really long. And I was like, oh, well, hopefully none of them will be this long anymore. And now I'm just kind of like, they're however long they end up being. And then Marcos adds like 7 pages anyway. So like, he'll always be like, oh, I could do this as a double page spread, And so, sometimes I'll see layouts and I'll be like, oh, what if we split this and added more pages? And, this would be a fun sequence. So yeah, I do feel like I'm legit having fun with it. But I'm also trying to remember to, that people don't really expect that from me. So I need to add in some, unfun sometimes too, and some pathos. But I will say chapter 6, I was shocked. I forget how much the difference between the conversation around digital comics and print comics is, because I thought chapter 6 was the best thing that Marcos has ever done in the history of his entire comic career. And it was like, that action scene is like him crossed with Steve Ditko and Junji Ito or something. And it's like, holy fucking shit. This terrified me to get the pages. I was like, oh my God, this is so visceral. And nobody was talking about it really. And I was like, oh wow, because people consume digital comics on a completely different, schedule in a way. And but it really is just the ability for us to just sort of take our time and just tell the story. And, we have 3 more chapters. So I'm figuring it'll be 1 more year. I'm hoping we'll get the next book out next Christmas. We've got the second one coming out, in a couple weeks. And, I think it'll be, once we're done with the first big Friday story, we'll figure out if we're going to do more Friday, if we're going to do something else, or if Marcos is going to go back to my enemy, Brian Vaughan.
I was considering bringing that up, but I have to bring it up now because every single newsletter from Brian on like the tower, the exploding giraffe, he's always like my nemesis, Ed Brubaker. I mean, I know that's not true, but where did that come from?
We've been friends for like 20 years. So
yeah.
I think he might secretly hate me. Him and Robert and I go out to dinners, before pandemic fairly frequently. But yeah, no, he and I, in the very early days of our career, were both us, and I think Brian Azzarello were all up for the Batman job. And I ended up getting that job, and I think Brian has hated me ever since then secretly. And I actually he did a couple of issues, scripts that they did, which came out during my run, and I was really angry at him because they were better than the issues I was doing. So I was like, fuck this guy. But then we became really good friends. Yeah. No, I don't think, but I love that he, because I think he was the one who told Marcos to reach out to me when he didn't have time to do something. So, but yeah, no, if Marcos goes back to Brian, that's it. We're over.
Done. It's done.
Yeah, all of them. I'll burn Panel Syndicate to the ground. However, I'll find that website wherever it is in real life.
Spain, somewhere, maybe.
Spain. I'm going to fly to Spain and find that server.
I like to think that somebody that reads Brian's newsletter actually thinks that he has an arch nemesis and his name is Ed Brubaker. They're probably like, what? Where did this come from? Why does nobody talk about this?
It's like Chip and
Ryan Stegman.
Yeah, Chip and Ryan Stegman.
Fake beefs in comics.
At this point, I was like, man, I feel bad for Ryan on this. And then I'm like, well, no, he seems to be playing his part in this quite well too.
Yeah.
They're like the oasis and blur of this era of comics.
Well, I do want to bring up the digital nature of it because it is fascinating. Like I talked to, I don't remember who it was, but I was talking to somebody that was doing a Substack comic, and it was basically one of the pieces of feedback I heard was, for some readers, it seemed like it didn't become real until it came into print. And so it's like you got the second volume for Fridays coming out December 14th.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Yeah. Like I think there's a lot of because I will say, and it's anecdotal, but based off of my newsletter, which goes out to like something like 10,000 people now, like when Friday first launched, like the first chapter, like a ton of people clicked to go over and get it for free or whatever they want to pay. And now like that number is very much like the waiting for trade number of people. I can tell it's like, oh, okay. A lot of people they would just rather read it as a book. And so, yeah, I do feel like it's like, maybe it's just completely separate audiences. Cause I don't know, internally for Panel Syndicate, what their averages are for, with their readership or, engagement or any of that stuff. For me, I just think about I think I'm a print guy. I think about the print part and, so it's like, I just let Marcos worry about that side. And for me, it's like, I just get the joy of, having stolen him from Brian. I mean, I get the joy of creating this wonderful book with Marcos.
Of course. I like this one quote you had in your most recent newsletter. You said, get it while it's hot and pay whatever you want, even if that means free. We do not give a fuck. We do it for the love of comics. And like, it is kind of cool. Obviously, you and Marcos would prefer it to be a success of some variety. But at the same time, it is kind of cool that Friday is like a project where you all can kind of cut loose. Like Marcos can really like dig into a page and he can make sure that those tentacles look as Junji Ito as possible. And you know, that like we really understand Friday and all these different things. And I think it was either the second or the third issue where Friday is kind of always going through snow, but there was this one snow scene where I was like, this is the best thing I've ever seen Marcos draw.
Oh yeah, there's so much in that chapter. Yeah, like the big snowstorm chapter. Yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't get that if you had to follow like a traditional release schedule. And, for some, maybe they'd prefer it to come out more often, but I'd also just rather Marcos do his best work. And if you just want to read it later, read it later.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, if Marcos was anywhere near as fast as Sean, I'd be having a nervous breakdown. Like, having the extra time to think it through and map everything out. Like, I knew the big twist that happened at the end of chapter 6, like from the time I wrote the first pages of chapter 1.
The girl in the trees.
I knew all of that stuff. That's why the first chapter was called The Girl in the Trees. But yeah, like, I love having the time to sort of look at everything he's doing. Like, chapter 6 ended up being a completely different thing. Like, halfway through chapter 5, I realized like how much fun it was seeing Friday do all this stuff. And then I was like, oh man, I need to end it with like a really big blowout action scene here, because I haven't really let Marcos cut loose. Like, normally he's doing a lot of, insanely choreographed action, like that Daredevil run he did. It's like, and I've got like one of the best action artists in comics drawing this thing. I was like, okay, let's go crazy here in the midst of this YA book. Like, let's bring the crazy horror into life, actually, because then it's like, holy shit, this story is way off the rails all of a sudden. This was cozy a minute ago.
I even like just the part where I'm trying to remember the name of the dog, where Friday is having to deal with the dog.
French fry.
No.
Oh no, the dog that's been. Oh yeah, the dog that's been trained to hate her.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. One of the evil gang's dogs. Yeah,
exactly. Like that dog, that whole scene. Like, it's not tentacle terrible or evil or anything, or like tough to deal with, but at the same time, it's still really intense. Okay, let's Ripper.
Yeah, with his spiked like collar.
That dog looks like a pain in the ass. Yeah,
because there were dogs like that in my neighborhood when I was a kid, where if like you leapt over into the yard, people just used to let dogs be out in yards when I was growing up, but people don't do that anymore.
Well, it's a very classic trope too. I mean, like, I know this is not the same type of story, but I think back to The Sandlot. You ever see The Sandlot?
Oh yeah,
where like they knock the ball into there where the beast is, and like they can't go back and get it, and it turns out the dog's actually nice the whole time, basically.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a very fitting trope for that story. But I wanted to ask about that. You knew going in, the girl in the trees, that you knew that was going to be a big part of it. You knew, generally speaking, that you would get to there around the end of the second act. How much of that middle stuff was just being inventive on the fly and shifting and moving things when you just happen to remember that Marcos is really great at drawing action?
Well, no, I knew all the stuff about her investigation. Like, I was notebooking and taking notes, like, because when you're doing a mystery like this, you want to make sure you're laying in some clues. So like, I knew the thing with the stone dagger and Weasel Wadsworth would being like having no memory, all that stuff. Like, I was thinking about all of that stuff, and I knew like the cop investigating the murder would be tied to the evil queen's, the white lady's plot. But yeah, some of the how I was going to get to it, I generally know the end of every chapter as I'm starting to write it, and I've got like my sort of like 3 or 4 things that need to happen, and then I kind of just think about what Friday would be going through in her head. Mm-hmm. Like where's she at emotionally at this point in the story, and how much needs to get accomplished. I mean, in the second book, there's so much about like the clues that she's finding that were left by Lancelot, who, gets killed at the end of the first book. And it's like, it's like somehow he knew he was going to die, and he's leaving her breadcrumbs, mm-hmm. And then now, the next chapter, which I'm writing right now, is like, we kind of get another look at the night of his death, which is like something I've been planning the whole time. And yet at the same time, I still, like, I planted seeds in there for things that I was going to do. And now I'm looking at them and I'm like, okay, well, do I need to do all of these, or can I, what else is happening here? And, like, I knew that there was, I knew big moves, basically. Like, I know that I know the end of the story, but I don't know like the 3 scenes before that exactly.
Yeah.
Right now, like I know all of chapter 7 and most of chapter 8, but I'm not 100% sure about everything in chapter 9 until the end at this point. But by the time I get to starting writing it, I'll have it figured out.
It is kind of fascinating. You wrote in the back of issue number 6 about how like people should probably go back and reread it because you'll start seeing those things. Even in the moment when I got to the turn, like where Friday reaches the point where she figures out who the girl in the trees is, I had maybe not a Kaiser Soze level of like revelation, but I definitely went back through my memory. I was like, holy crap, this was all there. It was all there. So yeah. Good job by you.
Yeah, even the shadow.
Yeah, exactly.
Like I had to tell Marcos that ahead of time, that at that moment, and he was like, "How?" And I'm like, "I'm not 100% sure, but I know there'll be a way."
Friday is such a fascinating character. In a lot of ways, she does feel like a protagonist that you would normally write, but in other ways, she feels like way different. Like I can't imagine Ethan reckless. Like, I can imagine him hitting somebody with a hockey puck, but I don't imagine him doing it with a stick first. I think he would just take the hockey puck and the stick and beat somebody with it.
Yeah.
That's a slight difference with Friday. But I am interested in, like, when you were kind of developing Friday and, like, kind of thinking about who you wanted to lead this story, did you deliberately try to differentiate her from the leads you normally write, even if the roots are similar? Or is it just about what the story needs to be, and that's kind of where you win?
Well, I've been thinking about the character probably since I was like 25 or something, or 26 years old. I had this idea I didn't know exactly what the milieu would be. I think when I originally was starting it, it would have been like a West Coast, thing about a girl who had been like the teen sidekick / bodyguard of like the smart kid.
Right.
Who then had to sort of come into her own and move on with life. I just always really liked that idea of like the teen detective grows up. So I'd been thinking about her character since, I was only probably, 5 or 6 years older than she is. So, there's bits and pieces of like my best friends from that time period that were girls. And there's bits and pieces of like Sally Kimball and, Harriet the Spy. But I always knew that she would be a little bit more edgy than them, and that the world that she was in would be like a darker, like the adventures would seem like the usual kind of kid adventures, but the things that they went through would be more monstrous a little bit. And so she would be a little bit more edgy, like the thing about the rock inside the snowball. And, like I wanted her to be kind of more of a badass in that way.
Yeah.
And just a little bit more vicious and so when she needs to be like more of a noir hero.
Yeah.
In that kind of milieu, because like Harriet the Spy doesn't punch people.
That is definitely her Jack Reacher side. She can beat some ass.
She's not afraid. She's not afraid of people.
No.
And also, she's being, it was subtle. I hung a lantern on it more in the second book, but like she's also from like an outsider family. Like sure, she has 2 moms, and is one mom is a librarian and the other one is like a college professor, and so she was already like a weird outsider kid. So, she's like that kind of tough tomboy girl who's now growing up and trying to figure out like, what is life when I'm, not dressing like a boy and getting in fist fights? How do I become like what I'm told is what a girl is supposed to be, like, which in the early 70s is, like a really interesting time because of, the shifting culture. So, but at the same time, there's still that thing of like going through high school and, seeing what, it's like, we've all gone through puberty.
Yes. One thing I like that you do where you kind of flip the character a little bit, but you also, even some of like the more innocent cases and stuff. I like what you did in issue number 6, where the innocent cases are actually connected to something that's extremely not innocent. And like some of those things that you do in there are really smart. But I do want to say
the missing cat is important too.
Oh, as a person who has grown increasingly obsessed with cats in my lifetime, I'm very excited to see what's going on with the missing cat. But before we move off of Friday, I know that you already emphasized this, but I really want to emphasize to anyone who's listening just how good Marcos and Munza are on this. Munza Vicente, the colorist. I mean, saying that like this is the best work of their careers is really saying something because of the stuff that they've done together and separately, to be honest. I don't know. I just kind of feel like everyone should be talking about it.
Munza's doing a really limited palette in every scene. And so it's really interesting. Like she's coloring it similar to the way comics were colored in the era that the story takes place.
Mm-hmm.
Like she's using, she's using some very slight gradations here and there, but really it's flat colors and we're laying on top. It's like, like when we were talking about it early on, the comparisons we were looking at were like Jim Steranko, like Captain America comics, and like just the way they used blue for everything in the background sometimes, and it's just really fascinating to try to do something that takes place in another time that also sort of captures the nostalgia of the way things looked then a little bit too.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just love looking at all the pages they draw, like the city and like everything, all the locations are just amazing. Every character is distinctive looking somehow.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that, I mean, like you emphasized that Marcos is very good at action, which is true. But the funny thing is Marcos is kind of good at everything.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just so good at everything. And it's funny because I don't think I would ever have thought this is the type of project I want to see from Marcos. Before I would probably say like The Private Eye might be like the apex for him. I mean, sorry, that I know that's Brian K. Vaughan, your nemesis, but at the same time,
what book? I don't know this book. I don't.
It was a small book. It was very small.
Like on the shelf right behind me.
It is like it's far. I don't want to say opposite of this, but I mean it's like the setting.
Well, I think the way he's drawing characters is still pretty similar, but like
yes,
the thing that is different with this one was like when we first were emailing about it, I brought up the idea of this kind of young adult book, the way there's a bunch of different artists that drew the illustrations for like The Great Brain and Encyclopedia Brown and Edward Gorey drawing all the John Belair's book, and there was always a lot of cross hatching and these little kind of forts that the characters were in, or garage hideouts and headquarters, like you always felt everything felt really cozy, and a lot of it was to do with the way the characters were sort of cross-hatched and they felt more palpable somehow. And so that was the only thing we really talked about, was trying to add a little bit of that kind of New England-y Edward Gorey-esque kind of thing to what he did. And I just thought, on the outside chance that you're interested in exploring something like that, like here's this idea, it's totally unlike anything you've done before. And he wrote back like 2 minutes later saying yes. So I was like, oh, thank God. Because I just thought, like, what would I love to see him do next? Like, based on looking at The Private Eye and Barrier. And I was just like, he could do this thing that looks like a 70s young adult, novel or something. Like, I was thinking of, like, if I was Wes Anderson and I wanted someone to draw my comic, I would want Marcos, and that's what I was thinking, was like, okay, if I'm Wes Anderson wanting to do an Edward Gorey-esque kind of mystery that's that where you want everybody to care about all the characters and just want to look at it constantly, it's like, this is the perfect artist for that.
That sounds extremely up Wes Anderson's alley, to be honest.
Yeah, give us a call, Wes.
Well, let's talk about your work with Sean Phillips a bit. I got to start with just saying that this might be recency talking, but I think Follow Me Down, the fifth Reckless entry, might actually be my favorite Reckless book so far. It's, for listeners that don't know, it's the flip side of The Ghost in You, the fourth book in the series, and it's about Ethan taking a trip down to San Francisco to search for a missing woman named Rachel, and it ends up being a much bigger case and experience than he expected. You said in your newsletter yourself that you thought that this might be the best one as well. My perspective, there's a number of things, and I'm going to share one of them very specifically.
Well, I always think they're not going to be the best one until I have like 4 or 5 people advance read it and then tell me that, oh, this is the best one. And then like, okay, maybe this is the best one, actually, not the worst one.
You have a healthy amount of self-doubt going as soon as you finish. Is that the case?
I do so much I read it over so many times in the week or two before we send it to print, just to check for typos or any sentences that bump me or anything like that. Like I just fine tooth comb these things so much that by the time we're sending it to print, I am so close to it that I've lost track of whether the scenes flow right or whether, it's saying anything or means anything. And I have to just basically let someone who hasn't looked at it at all read it, and, hopefully someone whose opinion I trust.
I feel like if I've read it so many times, or not that, but anything really, if I'm, editing one of my articles and I've reread it like 50 times, it starts becoming kind of meaningless at that point, where it's just like, it isn't even a thing. It's just an act I am doing.
Yeah, you just know it, and you start to be like, why did I use that word? What that word just sounds weird. It looks weird on the page. I get that obsessive about it, but now especially because I used to do that, with the comics. Like when we would collect the comics into a trade, I'd have made notes as we were going along about things I wanted to change as so the trade version is slightly different than the serialized version usually. Like not a ton, but like sentences here and there, or word balloons I'll take out or add or something just to make it read better. So I always looked at the serialization as like a first draft kind of, or not a first draft, more like a fifth draft. But yeah, with the graphic novel, publishing, I just became more and more obsessed with, the flow of the whole book and everything. So yeah, it really helps to step me off the ledge of, I blew it.
I will say this book gets into some dangerous territory just because there is a bit of a time jump. Like at one point, I don't, we all knew that at some point it was going to get a little closer to today because he's writing all of this from today. Yeah. And we get up to 2004. That could have been a risky proposition. I mean, it was a risky proposition. It could have went either way on you, but it went the right way. And I think the really fascinating thing about it is, and I'm not saying that you're going to do this, is there are so many directions you could go from here. Like I honestly think that if you wanted, there could be a spin-off series about another character and the journey that she has been on. I'm not again, I don't think you're going to do this. You got plenty of other things that you can do, but I do think it's really interesting how.
Oh, you mean Rachel?
Rachel, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, because her job now is kind of like another version of Ethan, except for the fact that she has something that's very personal that's tying her to this. Yeah,
there could easily be a book starring her. Yeah, I realized that too but I didn't realize it until I was done with the book, and I was like, oh, hey.
Yeah.
Like spin-off character.
Yeah. The fascinating thing about Reckless is in the beginning, it felt like you were just telling these stories about this guy and you were going to follow us on this journey. But it seems like with each passing book, instead of just closing doors, you just keep opening more doors. Like you want a story about Anna, you could tell a story about Rachel. You could do this, you could do that. And it's really fascinating how that works. And it's kind of not really how I originally imagined it. Do you find that happening a lot with this series in particular, where you tell a story and then find more in the process?
I think it's just the way that I write and the way that Sean and I work. I fell in love with Anna, from the first cover that he drew of her. That was the first time, he drew the cover first for the first book, I think, before maybe he drew the first 8 pages or so. So he'd drawn her once, but yeah, I just fell in love with her character immediately, and then started, writing the book, and in this next book, I wanted her to grow bigger. But I really quickly felt like I wanted the books to be more than just these little fun thrillers that would entertain you for an hour or two while you were reading it, and maybe you want to go back and read it again for fun. And I really felt early on the characters had to be people that we all wanted to just spend time with, and that their relationship, and writing it from now looking back, would get I realized early on it was giving it a weight that that I hadn't expected it to necessarily have initially, but that I knew that I really I wanted it to have, and I wanted it to be more about the characters than the cases. That's why I think Destroy All Monsters, the case is important and everything, but it's really about Anna and Ethan. Their story is probably 60 or 70% of the book, and the case is probably like 30% of the book.
Also her terrible boyfriend.
Yeah, her terrible boyfriend who talks during old movies.
And doesn't want people to talk during Jeopardy, which is like sociopath behavior.
Yeah. I thought like David Brothers said that was like the perfect shorthand for an asshole boyfriend, was the guy who asked you not to talk during. Can you stop answering the questions?
What are you doing here? Why are you watching Jeopardy, man?
Yeah. But I think what has kind of happened is similar to what happens with Criminal, I think, where with each story, I felt like the world and the tapestry that the characters were starting to create became deeper. And I almost feel like Reckless is like the flip side of Criminal, whereas Criminal is kind of about all these people surviving tragedies and struggling to go on and their fucked up families. Reckless is like about these two, good people trying to do good things, and this sort of this love that exists between them that's completely platonic. These two outsiders, damaged people who found each other and they're trying to do good for people, like I feel like that's kind of what the books are about. And I was struggling after the fifth one. One of the reasons that we decided to do Night Fever, like Sean had always been begging me to write something that took place in Europe. But I also just wanted to have like a little bit of a breather after 5 in a row to sort of figure out what to do next. Because like, as you said, like the third act of book 5 jumps ahead 15 years, which I just realized like the stories are so elastic. The format is so elastic. I could do anything I want next. Like I don't have to necessarily chronologically do 5 books that take place in the 90s or something. Like I can actually do something, more experimental than that. And then I started thinking, maybe I want to do a book where like part of it is a case that's in the 90s and part of it is a case that's like taking place in 2010 and they connect to each other somehow, and then I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like, and, realizing now that I've laid the groundwork with the books that I can sort of do whatever the fuck I want with them, as long as we're really exploring these characters and, what drives them. And Ethan, like the end of book 5, that last chapter where he's sort of re-embracing himself, I just was like, if we died and never did another one of those books, that's a satisfying ending in some ways.
Hell yeah, it is.
But there's some answers left unanswered still.
And now, a word from one of our sponsors. You may have heard of Zoop, the new crowdfunding platform, and they have some amazing comic campaigns running now, including Faceless and the Family from the Eisner-nominated Matt Lesniewski, The Whistling Skull from Tony Harris and B. Clay Moore, which continues their work on JSA Files and DC Elseworlds, and the completed Saucer Country, an omnibus collecting the whole series from Paul Cornell and Ryan Kelly. Better yet, with Zoop, there are no buggy add-on pages and surveys after the fact. You simply throw rewards and add-ons into your account and check out. Head to zoop.gg to support the live campaigns and sign up for launch alerts for what's next. Also, Zoop is taking submissions, so creators, reach out at hello@wearezoop.com to learn more. And now, back to the show. Well, I have to say, that was one of the things I was going to say from my perspective, why Follow Me Down is the best one yet. All of the other books, and I just flipped through them, all of the other books end with, I don't want to say bummer endings, but it's just like, it's Ethan looking back and being kind of bummed out about something that happened in his life. But the 5th book, it has this absolutely incredible final line where it's, instead of narration, it's him saying, "Now give me that hand," which is so perfect, both for it like as a change of pace relative to the rest of the books, but also because of what it said about Ethan and how he's back on his beat. He's back. He's shaved. He's ready to go.
Yeah.
I did like that because, I don't know, I mean, going back to it, it
gets right to the heart of who he is.
Right.
Like from the first book, like when he explains like why he does what he does, and it's like, yeah. That was like when I came up with the idea for that last chapter was like right before I started writing the third act. And I was like, oh, okay, I think I can pull this off now. because I know, and that's why, the whole thing about the dead dog got mentioned early on.
I just gotta say that dude deserved it. He probably doesn't feel like he deserved it, but he deserved it in my book.
Yeah, exactly. We're dancing around it really well.
I know.
Remember when Wolverine stabbed the guy with his claws?
The funny thing is so, when we were putting Neo Noir together, when I was rereading all of Criminal, I never read the entire series kind of consecutively.
Oh, wow.
Because, because I read in single issues, and I've read the individual stories. And so I have all the books in single issues, but I never read just kind of all the way through. And it was interesting seeing the first issue. There's a mention of, Frank. Have you read Frank today? Like the Frank Kafka story and everything like that. And like that is like setting up a story. And you're not knowingly probably setting up that story for later, but you're speaking into existence the presence of this thing.
That time I was.
Oh, you were?
Yeah, I had the first. Well, that was going to be the third book originally. And then I decided to do The Dead and the Dying because I wanted to do those 3 short stories that were interlinked.
Right.
But originally Bad Night was going to be the third book. And I knew, I had little 2-paragraph outlines when I initially pitched Criminal to Dan Buckley. And so in my notebook, I knew that the Frank Kafka strip was going to be by the guy who starred in Bad Night. Mm-hmm. I knew about, and that he was going to be a guy that they'd grown up with who was a ex
counterfeiter.
Yeah. But I had some of that figured out.
It is interesting though, because sometimes you know it and other times you don't know where it could go. And that's one of the things.
Yeah, sometimes it's just a happy thing that you're oh, I did this thing. I can go back to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's with Rachel. It's you could use that. What Rachel ends up doing for a career where she helps people who are kids who are in tough, or basically rescuing kids effectively.
Yeah, rescuing kids from human trafficking.
That could be a story unto itself, or it could just be something she could be a through line that keeps connecting to Ethan's story.
Yeah.
I did want to ask about writing a purely Ethan-centric story. Interestingly enough, I feel like writing an Anna-centric story might have been a bit easier than an Ethan one, because Anna's talkative. She's got emotions. She is not she's not flat as Ethan would put herself.
Yeah.
Did writing an Anna-less story present any surprising challenges, or did Rachel more than make up for Anna's absence?
Oh, no. I mean, I really missed having Anna she's mentioned a bunch by Ethan.
And she shows up. Yeah.
Yeah, she shows up, but she's yeah. No, I had no idea how difficult it was going to be. This one was a story that, had been in the back of my head for a long time. The Rachel story based on, different people that I've known who lived through, sadly, very similar things. And I wanted to do another story where Ethan got to sort of get in touch with his rage. Mm-hmm. Because I felt like if I was ever going to do a story where Ethan got somehow close to actually falling in love or anything, it would have to come through anger first. And so those pieces all sort of fit together. But yeah, I really felt like when they finally meet in the book, because it's he's trying to find this missing woman, and then he realizes that she's involved in this really dangerous situation. And instead of just finding her, he's out to try to save her initially. And so it's he becomes such this driven character that it's wow, he's a very dark guy. Just, and a guy who can drive for 22 hours and sleep for 2 and then drive and then get up and drive again. And, you really feel that. But I felt like his humanity came through so much in the story after that, because you've seen this sort of, it's he's decent to her husband, but he doesn't really feel pity for him. It's he's a complex character. He's harsh, and to find somebody that can touch his humanity and make him go deep enough that he cares to sort of be all right, fuck this, I'm going to help you. It's a very dark story, and I knew it was going to be, and I always knew from the beginning that that we were going to jump 15 years ahead at the end of that would be, because I always thought that was because that's what happens in life. You'll know someone for a few years when you're in your 20s or something, and then and then they'll disappear from your life, and then suddenly you're 40 years old and you're standing in an airport and you run into them, and suddenly they're part of your life again. It's like, I always thought about that. Like, what if you had a case that you didn't solve, as a private eye, and, your whole life happens for you in between, the last time you see this client, and then suddenly you show up at your office one day and here's this client from 15 years ago being like, hey, you want to finish this case? like I just always thought that was kind of a cool, like way to do it. But I really, it was tough. And I think I've maybe even told you, like, the last scene in book 4 where they're at the wedding and they sit down and talk, like, I thought that was my favorite scene maybe that I've ever written, but definitely that I've ever written with those characters, because it's just Ethan's sort of happy memory, one of his happiest memories of Anna. And, like, I don't know exactly why it works this way, but when you create these characters, you put pieces of yourselves and your own history and your past and your friends and, all these parts of yourself into these characters. And so it's like, even though Ethan and Anna are completely fictional characters, like, that weird love that they share, like, reflects, like, several friendships in my own life at various times in my life where I've had, completely platonic, best friend, girlfriend, best friends. And it's just like, I just always feel like it's just very powerful for me when I get those moments and they've landed. I always just feel like this is what keeps people coming back to these books, is the love between these two characters. And the fact that a little bit from the end of book 3, like the foreboding of, that one of them's going to live longer than the other one.
Yeah. The interesting thing about it all being written from our present is that it opens up all kinds of opportunities from a storytelling standpoint, but it also gets us, like you're saying, it's like you kind of have that sense of foreboding. That there's all these, like, dominoes to fall, these shoes to drop, and it makes it loom. I do think it's interesting, though, because I was originally thinking about the idea of, like, Night Fever, because you're coming off of 5 straight Reckless books over 2 years, because Sean is a maniac and you're a maniac.
Yeah.
But the idea of momentum and the fact that you have momentum for this. But I do think it's interesting because I do think people are invested in, like, say, Reckless, because they're invested in Anna's story and they're invested in Ethan's story and their relationship and everything like that. But also, it is interesting how with your stuff with Sean, I'm not saying it doesn't matter what you do. Like, if you did, like, a kid's book all of a sudden, I don't know if that would necessarily work or something like that. But, like, you've had this, like, long collaboration where people are really just there for you two instead of, like, I don't know, Zach Overkill or, like, Tracy Lawless or something.
Yeah. That's why our names are so big on the cover, is like, I knew early on that what we wanted to do with comics was that we would be the brand.
Right.
Not the type. We were never going to have a Walking Dead that we did for 100 issues, like Criminal's the closest to that. And it's a thing we stopped doing for years at a time and come back to. Now we'll probably come back to it as graphic novels, or maybe a magazine, or who knows what we'll do. But yeah, I've always thought that. And, a couple times I've argued with Sean that I was like, look, we're not really successful until our names are actually bigger than the title of the book. Like Stephen King, and then in tiny type, whatever, The Outsider.
I just think of James Patterson because, like, whether or not he's actually associated with the book, his name is just gigantic on it. And
his name is the biggest thing, even if someone else wrote the book. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's just like, doesn't matter who's involved, what the title is. James Patterson's name is like half the size of the front cover.
Yeah, that's why we just put our names on the front cover, and no one else's really. And we asked Jake ahead of time if he was going to be okay with that, because we've been doing this for 20 something years now. We are like, we're the team, we're the brand. Like, we love Jake, and I want Jake to color our stuff forever. But, that's always kind of part of the challenge of getting people to follow us from project to project, instead of just being like, oh, I tried that one thing. It's like, so, that's why, we used to always go from one project directly to the next, so we could tease in the final issue of one what we were going to do next.
Right.
That's why we started, when we had Incognito in the back of, issue 5 of Criminal or something.
Is Night Fever the biggest gap between projects you two have had outside of, like, the pandemic year? Because it's not coming until June, right?
It's not coming until June. Yeah, there's actually no gap in that we finished Follow Me Down. I think Sean took like a week or two off and then started drawing The Criminal, a short story for the Image book, and then started drawing Night Fever like the next week after he finished that. It's just that because we refused to like give anybody like a low end product, and printing and shipping and stuff has just gone through the roof in the like, it costs so much more to print books 4 and 5 of Reckless than it did to print books 2 and 3. So we just had to put in a longer gap in the production schedule so that we could print overseas where it's still affordable to give the kind of high quality project. You know, like the pulp process edition was the first time we printed overseas. And so, you know, so we just had to do that. So yeah, I wish that we could have gotten it out in April or May. I mean, we'll be done with it in January. So so we'll start the next thing right away. But you know, like it's closer to it feels weird because I'm like, wow, it's gonna take 6 months. Like it takes like literally like a week for them to print it, but it's just the shipping and distribution and you know, and they have to put in a bunch of cushion time because, you know, there's shipping delays all the time now. And, you know, so.
I mean, the interesting thing is I think with other creators, you could get away with it. You could get away with like getting it out faster because you don't have like the same expectations of the standards. But it's like, I really do think part of your, I don't want to say formula, but your recipe and what people know you for is that they're going to get a high quality book. It's going to be really like good paper stock. It's going to be really well made.
Yeah. I mean, I think I care more about the comics, but I equally care that they're art objects too. It's like they're an art object that also hopefully has a great story.
Yeah.
Great art in it. But I also want it to be on really nice paper. And, you know, I mean, the first Reckless book, we actually printed on 100 weight paper, which felt too thick to me. Mm-hmm. So we went down to 80 weight. But like the quotes we're getting for 80 weight now are like, you know, 20, like so much more, like 30% or like 200% more than it cost to print on 100 weight, like 2 years ago.
That's so crazy.
So yeah, it's, I mean, that freaked me out because I was like, well, what are we going to do? Like, we can't just start charging, you know, $5 more per book for the same thing. Not so yeah, we just really care about that. You know, it's like we're print people. I think we when we were at DC doing Sleeper, like we never got to have a hardback, you know, like way back then. Like they did eventually do that big Sleeper hardback that they keep reprinting every now and then. But you know, until we did our own Criminal Deluxe Volume 1, like we'd never had a hardback before or stuff. So now we got kind of addicted to like the designing and putting out these books and selecting the paper and the cover stock and all that stuff. Like that's so much part of the fun for us. And to actually see the book, like I open the books and immediately open it to the middle and just put it around my face so I can smell the fresh printing. like, you know, when you were a kid and you got an action figure and you had to smell how weird the action figure smelled.
I think one of the times that I most weirded out one of my guests is when I had Matt Fraction on, and I told him that I think one of my things was just that Solid State smelled really good. Because like as soon as I just like smelled it, and it just, the paper was so great. But I wanted to bring up the graphic novel of it all because it's interesting. You're writing Friday, and Friday is episodic in a single issue sense, but it's only in print. It's only coming out in the trade paperbacks.
Yeah.
Do you, I mean, given the success you've seen in the graphic novel format, do single issues really even appeal to you as a storyteller at this point? Could you see yourself going back in that direction, or do you feel like that's kind of a phase that you and Sean in particular are kind of done with?
I don't know. Like for right now, I definitely feel like I don't want to go back to that. You know, I don't think Friday would make sense that way because a single issue thing that comes out every 3 or 4 months just isn't sustainable.
No.
You know, I mean, it was barely sustainable when 8-Ball was doing it, you know, in the 80s. Like, if you're going to do single issues in magazines, they have to come out, you know, 6 or 8 times a year at least for people to keep track of them, I think. For me, just the appeal of making each story that we do, like an object itself. And like the Reckless series, I had no clue that we were going to do that until we suddenly were doing it. And then I was like, holy shit, this is super fun. And now I feel like that we've, now that we spent like 2.5 years doing nothing but graphic novels, I kind of feel like we've earned ourselves, the ability to sort of, let's do a different one. And, maybe let's, like I want to do like, I have an idea for a sort of, I say a sequel to the Fade Out, but it's not a sequel to the Fade Out. It's like another book in the same world of the Fade Out, starring a different main character, but who was a character in the Fade Out. And I want to do that. And I'm just like, well, I just want to do that as a graphic novel, which would be, a couple hundred pages long probably. So that'll take Sean longer, a couple months longer to draw than it would take him to draw a Reckless book.
It would make every other artist super mad how fast he would do it, though.
Oh, yeah. No. I mean, the art he's doing now, like you've seen some of the pages, that art he's inking. If anyone has the Wally Wood artist edition from like the 1950s EC Comics, where the pages are like half the size of a human body, that's how big Sean is inking right now. And he's still inking just as fast as when he was inking, 25% smaller than that. And the art is the most amazing thing. Like, honestly, he sent me 5 pages yesterday, like that he'd drawn this week so far. And they were like among the best pages he's drawn in our entire career together. And I'm just like, holy fuck. And, more pressure on me to make sure I land the ending.
I mean, that is kind of like the defining part of your relationship, is like Sean constantly applying pressure to you to turn up pages and better pages at that. I had a question about how you figure out what you're going to do next, like whether or not you have ideas always there. But I do think it's interesting, like particularly for something like Night Fever, where it's not like it's not that you're telling this story exclusively to like get a break from Reckless or something like that, but it does feel like, you need those change of pace. You need something that isn't just that. Are you, for like Night Fever, are you aiming for like a palate cleanser that just changes things up for you and Sean? Or is it just that happened to be the right story for right now?
Well, it was a story that I started thinking of around 2009. This sort of vague idea for a character who was like an insomniac who went out at night and, sort of got involved with a different world that doesn't exist during the day. That was sort of the germ of it. And it felt like a very noir idea, like the idea of some guy pretending to be someone else and trouble following him home because of it. And so I just had a bunch of different ideas for how to tackle it and who the character would be and what the trouble would be. And I never really got around to totally breaking it, but it was an idea that I would come back to in my head sometimes when I was trying to figure out what we were going to do next. And then when we were getting ready to finish, when Sean was probably like 20 or 30 pages from the end of Follow Me Down, I think we were just emailing back and forth about what we were going to do next. And he mentioned again that I kept promising to do something that was set in like Europe or London, so he could draw something that felt that he actually experienced in life ever, locations he's actually been, etc. Photos that he's actually taken. And I started thinking about that, and I suddenly, like, the idea clicked, because I kept thinking like, well, what thing would I do? And I haven't spent that much time in Europe or England, and the times I have has been like comic conventions or vacations, or like I got engaged in Portugal like at a comic convention, and then and I've visited there many times after that because of that. But other than Portugal, I haven't spent a lot of time in foreign cities. So suddenly I like had this like thing where it was like, Sean wants to draw this kind of thing. And then I thought of that old idea and I thought, oh. And then I started thinking about it and thinking about like who the character was and what they were going through. And it just kind of jived at the moment. Like I was like, oh, okay, that feels like something that maybe it's time to actually write, because it's like, with whatever thing you're writing, you're always trying to somehow write something about what it feels like to be alive at this exact moment in time. Even if you're writing about the past or writing about, the Fade Out was I was working in television in Hollywood and taking a shit ton of Hollywood meetings for years and, sort of in that world. And, a lot of the feelings that the characters were going through were things that I was grappling with. And, so no matter what story you're writing, you're kind of trying to, tackle something that's going on in your own personal life, even if you don't want to reveal what exactly that is. I'm open about a lot of things in my personal life, but I'm not really that open about, some of the inspirations for my stories. And, this is a really weird time to be alive for a lot of us who don't live in Canada.
Right.
Or New Zealand or somewhere that feels safe.
Right.
But I suddenly realized this potential for this book and that it would be completely different than anything, that we'd done at least recently. And then as I started writing it, I realized like there were things where I was like, oh, we did a thing, so I realized like, oh, okay. So as I'm writing it, I'm like, oh, I've touched on some of this before. So like, okay, how can we make this one different? And what is it about this character and their journey? And, so it's kind of like our first version of like weird noir, where it's like I think of it, it's inspired by like when I fell in love with like Black Lizard paperbacks when I was like living in Berkeley, like down the street from Moe's Books, and I would just go every day and get like a different, Black Lizard book for like $1 and just tear through all of these like really fucked up old, out of print noir books. And but also because Sean wanted to do something that took place in Europe, I kind of felt inspired by the European comics that I had read as a kid too, which mostly came from like heavy metal or issues of Metal Hurlant or, various Spirou or whatever magazines we would get. And I always loved how like, even if I didn't understand the stories or what the hell was going on in these things, like this weird sort of otherworldly, mysterious beauty of some of the European comics that I would read, like Mobius or Bilal or, some of this stuff. So I wanted to do something that sort of felt like it could exist in those worlds a little bit, like somewhere between like noir and that kind of weird 70s Europe, like when I think a lot of exciting, changes were happening in comics over there. So I wanted to do something that sort of felt of that a little bit. And I don't know that that'll be evident to anyone but us, like looking at it. But yeah, it's just been kind of a blast, like pushing my way through it and figuring out, like I knew the end all along. And, but it's definitely different for us. Like it would be, I hesitate to make comparisons, but I've been thinking a lot about like Fellini and Lynch and stuff when I'm writing it, and allowing characters to do things that I wouldn't normally allow them to do, and not feel like I have to necessarily explain everything that the characters are doing. So it's a strange thing. And it's a little bit influenced by my time working with Refn, I think, too. It's like probably the first thing I've written since I stopped working with him that I can see some of the influence of my time with him. One of the characters reminds me of some of our times together.
And now, a quick word from our sponsor. It's Bad Idea, and they are back. And this time, I really mean it. It's Bad Idea 2 Part 1, which sounds crazy, but hear me out. This first wave of 7 titles with 15 releases includes fantastic creators like Ramon Villalobos, Tamara Bonvillain, Joshua Dysart, Alberto Ponticelli, and more on superbly titled comics like Escape from Wyoming, a future winner for the best named comic Eisner. Want to read those titles and more? Presumably, at some point? Visit Bad Idea's site and find the Bad Idea store nearest you and make the magic happen. And now, back to the show. It's funny, you're making some very apt comparisons that definitely are a lot closer than this, but when I read The Solicit, which talks about how basically it's Jonathan Webb is like in Europe on a business trip, and he meets this guy Rayner who shows him the hidden world of the night, which seems really cool at first, but then becomes very dark. My take, the first thing that popped in my head was like Nightmare Before Sunrise. because it's just like,
Oh,
it's like,
I thought you were going to say Into the Night, that old Jeff Goldblum movie.
no. Instead of Julie Delpy, he gets this guy Rayner who seems a lot less fun eventually. But
Oh.
here's a tip for a future newsletter if you'd like it. One of my patrons was very enthused by the fact that you mentioned the press release. You already talked about this a little bit, but is the fact that Night Fear is partly inspired by, and he quoted weird and sexy European comics. If you ever have any recommendations for that, I think your readers would be very enthused with that because it seemed like there was a hook there.
That's amazing. Yeah, there's some graphic sex in this book, I will say.
That's why Sean's got to draw it big.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to close with some industry talk. You know, we've kind of touched on some of this stuff in the past, but we've never really dedicated very much time to it. We are in, by most accounts, a still high time in both the direct and book markets. Maybe not the same heights as last year, but, you know, things are still strong. It's an interesting time, though. Like, you know, some of the conversations I've had have had a lot of buts at the end of, like, the positive stuff. Obviously, you've been in comics for a long time. You're not quite as reliant on them as you once were, but you still pay a lot of attention to how things are going. You know, as an insider with a little distance from it, I'm interested in your perspective on the state of comics right now. Like, how do you feel about the way things are going?
Well, it's kind of hard for me to judge. I'd love to hear some of what people are telling you because, like, there's a few retailers I talk to. There's other creators that I talk to. I feel like, you know, when I go to the stores that I go to now, it really just feels like the variant cover thing is a thing that nobody really likes, but we're all sort of stuck with. It's like the thing no one really wants to talk about is that everyone kind of hates it. It's like when you get like emails or texts from political parties, it's like none of us actually want that.
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's like, and it just keeps happening. And you're like, God damn it, how many times do I have to say stop? Like, I feel like the variant cover thing, when it started, it was like a couple here or there, like, and sometimes stores would want them, and it's like some store would be buying 1,000 copies of your comic, and I always felt a little bit like, are you gonna be able to sell them? Like, what's, you know, is this gonna mean you're never gonna order any of my books again because you didn't sell 800 copies of a book, you know, because you only had 200 customers or something? Like, I never knew, you know, and we dealt with it a little bit here and there for like first issues of things because it was like, well, you know, it's hard to turn down free money, and
Right.
they're saying they're going to buy them. But I always felt a little bit like, I just want to know how many people are actually reading the books. Like, I want our audience to be, you know, they can be collecting our books because we make nice art objects and stuff, and they can be buying multiple copies to give out to friends or family or whatever. More power to them all. But when I see like all the different variant covers, it's just so hard to follow. Like, when I go into a store now after years of not having been in one, I'm like, well, where do I just get the, you know, the issues? Like, I just feel lost in that with the single issues. And, you know, I'm old man, and I've never been a comic collector. I've been a comic buyer and reader, you know, so that side of it, I don't quite understand. But then I see guys like Tynan and Tom King and Elsa and, you know, Scott Snyder, and, you know, these guys who are really savvy about the market and also are incredibly successful, like, for their actual work. And they're doing all of that too. And I'm like, well, you know, maybe I'm the one who just hasn't been paying attention. It just feels like it would be a lot of work to try to get like 18 to 20 different covers for every single issue that you're doing. But I start to, you know, like, just as an observer, it makes me worry about like the subsistence of like how many actual people are buying and reading these things. And
Right.
is there any way to even know? And how much of it is just speculators buying a couple different covers that they can sell somewhere? Like, but, you know, then you have something like Invincible on Amazon, and, you know, Invincible trades, you know, are now selling better than Walking Dead trades were selling when Walking Dead was, you know, the biggest show on television. So, like, I feel like there's still a lot of access to getting things to readers, because those people buying Invincible trades are not buying them to like sell them on eBay. Like
that would be a very like self-defeating process right there.
yeah. So I feel like there is still a lot of readers out there, I know, and it's just like I'm starting to feel a little bit like when I go into the store, I'm not 100% sure like what is the focus of this market right now. Like
Right.
Is it like I'm more focused on graphic novels, and I feel like a lot of alternative comics has basically, other than Love and Rockets and Red Room, maybe there are very few like alternative comics that still put out single issues at all. And for years, Love and Rockets went to graphic novels instead. Yeah, I don't know. I feel a little bit concerned always. I've been concerned about the comics market my entire life, and like you said, as far as I can tell, 2020 and 2021 were the biggest years for the comics industry ever. So like I worry about stuff and everybody worries about stuff, but comics keeps thriving somehow, and I just always want us to be the little engine that could. And so we all stand around pointing out the things that we think are wrong, like if variant covers are what are keeping stores able to order my books or other people's books, and keeping enough people coming in every week to keep the shelf stocked, then I guess I'm a big fan of variant covers. Because I just want the direct market to continue to exist. I feel like it's a miracle. Like it's a completely independent source of publishing. Like I know independent booksellers are coming back a lot bigger than, now that some of the big chains have closed down, but the direct market, it's a huge web of stores that are run by people who actually know what the fuck, comics are.
Yeah. The interesting thing about it is, and, we talked about variants off the record, or not off the record, off Zoom previously, and I've been looking into it for a bit for a piece that I'm working on. And the interesting thing is like I would say that by and large, a lot of the creators I've talked to have been a lot more positive about it than I expected.
Oh.
To the point where like one of them was like, I'm going to be like the pro variant voice in here. I'm like, no, you're not, because there's several other ones. But the retailers have like an interesting like kind of love-hate relationship with them where it's like sometimes they're useful, but there's an over-reliance on them. And I think the interesting thing about it is like one of the tough questions is like, let's say, comic X is ordered for 6 figures. There's 6-figure orders. Like the question is like, how many distinct readers are there?
Yeah.
And like, maybe the question is like, are single issues the format for collectors and speculators and trades and graphic novels now like purely the domain of readers? I don't really know. But one thing that I thought was an interesting wrinkle to this, and this came from a prominent retailer that will be quoted in my article, his take was, it's not that there's too many variants, it's that there's too many comics.
Well, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Well, but it's interesting because like, I actually did a recent comparison, and like Marvel and DC are actually publishing less than they had in the past. It's like there's just a lot of new publishers in recent years.
That's true, yeah.
I think retailers are struggling to ascertain what will actually sell. Things do sell.
Well, and I would think having, if you're from a smaller publisher with like lesser known creators and a brand new title with a new concept, I would think making a retailer have to order 10 different covers is not necessarily going to help you. The store I shop at, like, I believe, unless it's like some big book, they just pick one cover and that's all they order. They don't order like, because it's like when you're up to like, and cover M by, Pepe Larraz, and cover Z by, Chip Zdarsky, it's like, I could practically get work sketching covers at this point. Because people need them.
I think Bendis did a cover for a crossover. I think there's been a couple, right? Kirkman's done, I think, a couple. Who knows?
Someone's forwarded me a cover I drew back when I used to be a cartoonist for the first issue of Low Life, was like sold on auction for like way more money than I could have ever imagined any of my crummy art ever being sold for. And I was like, wow, that's just because I created the Winter Soldier. That's not because of that art.
If you ever need to make a quick buck, you now know how to do that. But
sell all my old art that I hate.
I do think one other part about this that's interesting is that, both in my conversations with people and in just seeing things like Jeff Lemire and Andrea Sorrentino, or like I like how they're playing with formats with their Bone Orchard Mythos stuff at Image. Like they're doing a lot of interesting things. But then also like James Tynion just signed a deal over at Dark Horse for Substack releases.
Yeah.
And Jason Aaron is like rolling out his new Once Upon a Time at the End of the World series at Boom, which near as I can tell, I think it's like a maxi series comprised of miniseries. But it feels like we're at this like throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks phase of things, where people are kind of experimenting because.
Well, I wonder, I suspect the Tynan Oming stuff like went to Dark Horse, because Bendis has his stuff over there. And so
imprints.
Dark Horse is giving people, different kinds of deals now than they used to. I've been told by a bunch of people that Dark Horse's creator deals are
better,
much better than, they used to be, like probably basically the Image deal. I don't know for a fact because I don't have one, but it's probably close to the Image deal if it's not, and so I think, part of it is just spreading things around. It's good as a creator sometimes to publish through a bunch of different places to see who's, to keep people on their toes sometimes, or to see who's doing better at what, sometimes even just going through like a different publisher, their publicist will do something that you wouldn't have thought of. And then it's like, oh, now I have a new contact.
Yeah.
So there's like a lot of reasons to go to different publishers now than there used to be. I used to, when I was at Marvel, even I would tell them this sometimes, that if I were in charge, I would cut the line down to like 25 or 30 books a month and just get the best people on all of those and have the same writer and the same artist on a book for years and years at a time, regardless of, sales fluctuations. I would run a company that would basically go out of business monetarily, apparently, because I wouldn't do events, or like I'm the guy who quit reading Marvel comics for a year when Secret Wars happened because I was like, oh, fuck this thing. I just want to read Spider-Man and now he's got a black costume. What's going on here? Like, oh, you're going to try and trick me into reading this thing? So I've never been a fan of the crossover or the event thing. Even the ones I've worked on, I've always felt like, I feel like if we just did this in the comic with just one creative team instead, like we would, with less voices going on, we'd end up with a more interesting event that still did all the same stuff, but was maybe a little bit focused different or something. So like all of that stuff that Marvel and DC constantly do to keep themselves viable, which now, they're doing all the variant covers and everything too. Like all of that stuff, I just, I feel alienated from it as a creator. Like it doesn't appeal to me as much. And, when I go to the stores and I see all that, it just makes me like wonder, like, well, who's buying these comics and are people reading them? And so I would always be like, let's cut it down, just like 30 comics from each publisher. That's still 60 superhero comics a month. Can you imagine? Mm-hmm. And it's like, and you could, spend more time on them instead of 75 or 80 books a month or whatever. It just seems uncontrollable.
And you have twice the variants.
Yeah, and I just thought, if you had better books, you've got you just do 50 variants per book. But if you had half the books, you might end up selling more books because have hopefully they'd all feel like they matter a little bit more if there's less of them. Like that's kind of pie in the sky thinking probably on my part as a creator, because I don't see their books and I don't know how much, they're juking the stats with all those variants to keep, Jason Aaron paying his, mortgage. And I like Jason Aaron a lot.
I do think it's kind of interesting, though, because one of the things that retailers told me during like the upswing in 2020 was that part of the reason why they were, more single titles were selling better was because there was fewer of them and they were able to hand sell them better.
You have to do that with comics. You have to, like, when you're at the register, if you're just putting stuff on the shelves and not going out and talking to your customers about it, like when I worked at Comic Relief, I was not the world's greatest employee, as Rory would have told you, but I was great at being the comic book bartender. I remember 8 Ball had just started coming out when I worked there, and the first issue we sold like 25 copies of. And then I started working there, and like by issue 3, we were selling like 500 copies because I would make everybody buy it. And I would be like, look, if you don't like it, bring it back and you can get something else. And I didn't ask for permission to do that. I just did that. But nobody ever brought it back. Everybody just put it on their sub list. And suddenly we were like selling more copies of 8 Ball than any store in the country. And, you know, it was like, if you find books that you love and you turn people onto them, that's what, you know, I mean, I've been rereading all of Love and Rockets the last couple months just because I hadn't in a long time, and been going back and reading a lot of old graphic novels and stuff. And I just was realizing like how just amazing all the, like, I've been, especially the Jaime stuff right now, I'm like rereading Locus and, you know, all of the stuff he did after that. And, you know, just that world he created is so amazing. And it's like, that's what I want to think of as comics. It's like you go, I want to go into the store and see all those books, and, you know, and, you know, people care about those. Those were like an event whenever they came out, when, you know, in the 80s and 90s, especially back, you know, in the sort of heyday of the comic market, when we had like 12,000 stores or something.
Yeah. You know, I wanted to close with a patron question I got from Dennis Hoffman, which I thought wrapped a nice bow on all of this stuff. And it's actually very specifically about a compliment that you actually got from Brian Michael Bendis on Mark Miller's new interview series, Miller Time. I don't know if you saw this. Brian mentioned that you have a knack for understanding when a change is coming and moving before it happens. And apparently he cited your early departure from Caliber Comics, leaving Marvel to focus on your own work, and then going the original graphic novel route before, like he did with like Phenomena, and like Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda did with like Night Eaters, and et cetera, et cetera. In his mind, I think accurately, you're always kind of ahead of the moves that are coming. And Dennis asked about your feelings about Brian's note, asking specifically, what do you attribute that to? Is it just you looking to control your fate more than comic creators from the past could?
I mean, I love that I'm sort of Brian's canary in a coal mine. From the outside, it looks like that.
It's just luck.
From the inside, like, the reason I left Caliber before him, he was having more success there, and like I had a conflict with the publisher, so I left. And then everybody started having conflicts with the publisher, so I looked very prescient.
Yeah.
With the Marvel thing, I remember I was walking down the street with Brian and Matt after one of the days of the summit, and I'd been there for about 8 or 9 years, and I think I had just listened to people argue about the rules of magic like so many times, and I just was like, I just didn't see like a path forward for me there, and it just felt like I didn't think I was ever going to get any bigger from doing anything else at Marvel, and I felt like I'd done stuff I was really, really proud of there. And I was to the point where the jobs that I was being offered because of my deal there were the kind of jobs I didn't really want to have to do. Like, I didn't want to do team books and stuff like that. I wanted to do weird little single character things. But I remember walking down the street with those guys, and they were talking about something from the meeting, and I was like a foot behind them, and I was like, I think I'm done. And then we were like sitting at pizza a couple minutes later, and Brian was like, what did you say? I was like, I think I'm done. I think this is my last summit.
Yeah.
And then they were like talking about something else, and I was like, wait, seriously? And then I just remember thinking like, yeah, I just feel like I can't do this anymore. Like, this isn't doing it for me. I feel like I dread these more than I'm excited about them. And I used to be excited about them. Like, you know, the first one I was so excited about, like, you know, like showing up in the room, and me and Mark and Brian sitting there and just cracking jokes while, you know, Jeff Loeb and Joe Quesada are screaming about what Doctor Strange can do or not. It was like hilarious. There was a moment where Gwen Stacy almost came back. I was there for that. So there was like, it was a really fun time, but I just kind of felt like burned out. And I know like I was getting more like things where editorial were suggesting directions for stories that I didn't want to write. And just kind of like anytime an editor would try to be more forceful about a thing, I would just either, that if I didn't want to do it, I would just say no or quit the book, and so in my whole career, like I've just kind of written the books that I've wanted to write. I've rarely ever just like taken a job. Like I ended up on X-Men, which was actually a favor to Millar. I was just going to do a fill-in, and Mark was going to take over both X books for like 2 years or something. And I think Brian Hitch was going to draw one and Joe Quesada was going to draw the other. And then it never happened. And so then I was just stuck on X-Men. And I was like, I didn't even want this job, but I'm trying to do a good job. I used to love the X-Men as a kid. Like it was not, but I was like, God damn it. I was just trying to hold this seat for Mark for a little while. And then I roped, Fraction into it so it would be more fun for me. And, and it seemed like a job more suited for him than me. But yeah, really it's just, I love that Brian thinks that way of me. Brian, I'm pretty sure I owe more of my career to Brian than Brian owes me anything. Plus, he never listened and followed me immediately anyway. He always waited a couple years too long.
He just needs to watch you. Just keep an eye on what you're doing.
Yeah, right. He doesn't have time. He's writing like 9 comics a month.
I do think it's, the original graphic novel route is really interesting, though, because like talking to creators, it does seem like, and it's not universal, but there are more people who are talking about how like they're kind of interested in like the book market side of the things, not just in the sense that like they want to publish something for like First Second or something like that, but like something that's more book market friendly, like a graphic novel. That is kind of an interesting shift, and honestly an appealing shift to me as a reader.
Yeah. Well, we have like a big feature in like Library Journal this month about the Reckless books because, obviously they're very library friendly. So it's like, I think doing them as books, I mean, any comic, you should be, as the creators, you should be super precious about every aspect of what you're putting out. Like you should care about the inside cover and the paper and, you should care about every aspect of it. But there's something about doing them as books that makes me feel like I want to try even harder to make sure each one deserves to exist in a weird way. Like it makes, whereas sometimes, when you're on a monthly comic book schedule, you're just trying to make sure you get something done that month.
It's like a survival.
It's like survival and staying above water. And, a lot of great comics are made that way, no matter what. But I feel like, this is going to come out as a hardback book. Like I don't know. I feel a little bit differently about it as I work on it. Like I'm, like Night Fever, as we're working on it, like I keep, diving deeper into it and being like, is this enough? Is this going to be good enough? Or does it need to say more than this? Or, is this going to be clear? Like, does this book deserve to exist? Like, will this book be, somebody's favorite graphic novel that comes out next year? Like I want someone to read it and have their mind blown, even if 10 other people read it and they're like, this is the worst thing they ever did.
The guy that's really excited about the weird and what was it? Weird and sexy European comics. I'm guessing he's going to have his mind blown, but
yeah, let's hope.
I'm sure it will end up being somebody's favorite. But Ed, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about Friday, Reckless, Night Fever, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer Ed Brubaker. You can find his work in Friday at Panel Syndicate, the Reckless series at Image, as well as the upcoming Night Fever at Image. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman as well, who stepped in to edit this episode and is the reason why it sounds as good as it does. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show on patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Brian, Matteo Ciccati, Chris Doré, Nir Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Cancel Comics, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnston, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Damstead, Ron V, Devin Fitzsimons, Nick Walker, Patrick Hoyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Norb Studios Comics, Nicholas Palmieri, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Brian, Submit Industries, Raj Patel, Jack Mulqueen, Kyle, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Elliot Metz, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwoods, Michael Tunk, Canadian by Proxy, Johnny Cannon, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Brower, Declan Shalvey, Dan Guarino, Josh Williamson, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, SB, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, AbductedTheComic.com, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Hall, Pensacola Pop Comics, Kim Eslem, Philip Myra, Christian Shelton, Kenny Porter, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Tall, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Danny Ollie, Paul Salates, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Gibbs, Sean Kirkham, Alistair Ross, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Ayala, Dave Slusher, Akil Kokachi, Sean Pinello, Ken Hedelman, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Robert Wilson IV, Nick Polito, Brendan Fletcher, Jonathan Nilsson, Jason Assey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Payson, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Chris Palmer, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Kat McKenzie, Adam Highfill, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Mike Murphy, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Debenakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's theme song just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.